So coming off the last video where I talked about non-duality, I wanted to share something on a similar topic, and this video is inspired by one of Leo's videos over at actualize.org. He did a video quite a while back on Aztec non-duality. And the reason why that video was so interesting is because normally we think of non-dual traditions as being predominantly Eastern traditions. You know, they're only found in Japan and China and India, in religions such as Taoism or traditions such as Advaita Vedanta. But no, Leo introduced this idea to us that even over in the Americas back in ancient times, Native American tribes such as the Aztecs had traditions talking about non-duality. And not only did they have a concept of non-duality, but their ideas about non-duality were actually just as advanced, if not more advanced, than what the non-dual traditions over in Asia had. So essentially, I wanted to one-up Leo and share a video with a non-dual tradition that's even more surprising than one that comes to us from the Native Americans, and it's arguably even more advanced. Like I said, Aztec non-duality was already in some ways more advanced than the non-dual traditions in Asia, but this one that I'm about to share with you, there's aspects of it that I think are even more advanced than the Aztec tradition. And when I say more advanced, I'm not saying that objectively. You know, when I say that it's more advanced, I mean it's more clear-cut. They explain the concepts better. They paint a clearer picture. Ultimately, they're talking about the same thing. So really, none of these traditions are more advanced than the others, but there are certain traditions that do make these ideas easier to understand and accept and apply to your life. So I'm going to share one such tradition that's even more clear-cut and clarifying than Aztec non-duality. And that tradition is, as you should know by the title of this video, Jewish non-duality. Now, what makes this tradition a bigger surprise than the Aztecs having a non-dual tradition? You know, sure, it's a huge surprise that rather than non-duality just being this far Eastern sort of concept or tradition, we find that peoples over in the ancient Americas, the far West, the complete opposite side of the world, had non-dual traditions. Well, in my opinion, Jewish non-duality is still more surprising because it comes from a Western Abrahamic religion, not just any Abrahamic religion, but the original one, the most ancient one, which is Judaism. You know, the three Abrahamic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but Judaism predates Christianity by 2,000 years. So it's by far the most ancient of the three Abrahamic religions, and so it's the most rooted in these sort of Western ideals. And Western ideals tend to be opposite to the ideals and values that we find in Eastern traditions. You know, like Eastern religions such as Taoism and Buddhism, they look for the truth within themselves. You know, they meditate to find the truth, whereas Abrahamic and Western religions such as Judaism and Christianity, they look for the truth outside of themselves. They look for it in some God who exists out there. And so they're completely opposite to each other in this way, and that's what makes a non-dual tradition from one of these religions even more surprising than one that comes from the Aztecs. Because sure, the Aztecs existed on the completely opposite side of the world to East Asia, but they still lived a more holistic lifestyle similar to people in typical Asian cultures, whereas these Western cultures are just completely opposite. So to find that Judaism has a tradition of non-duality. That's what's so surprising. And it's not just Judaism. The other two Abrahamic religions have non-dual traditions as well. Christianity has monasticism, whose goal is to merge with God or become one with God in Christ consciousness, essentially literally come to the Father through Jesus Christ by attaining Christ consciousness and merging with God. And then you have Sufism, which is Islamic non-duality. It's the same goal, merging with Allah, and Allah in Arabic just means the God, so they're really just talking about merging with the same Abrahamic God. But this Jewish tradition that I'm going to go over in this video is called Kabbalah. Kabbalah is Jewish non-duality, and every religion, not just the Eastern religions and Western religions, but really every religion at its core has a mystical or non-dual tradition. So in Judaism, it's Kabbalah; Christian, it's monasticism; Islam, it's Sufism; Hinduism has Advaita Vedanta, and I believe there's one called Siddhana as well. And then in Buddhism, there's Tantra. And so every single religion has one of these. But let's get into Jewish non-duality. I'm going to be quoting from an article that I came across. I actually first came across this article a few years ago. I recently read it again, and so I found a lot of content that's similar to the content that I've been sharing in my recent videos. So I'm going to read over it to sort of clarify and pave over everything that I've been talking about. And I'll post a link down below too. So this article says, people the world over have different ways to talk about God. At some point, the Kabbalists, remember Kabbalah is Jewish non-duality, the Kabbalists began calling God the infinite light. For example, know that before the emanations were emanated and the creations were created, there was a supernal simple light filling all of existence. There was no vacant space, rather all was filled with that simple endless light. There was no beginning and no end. Rather all was one simple light with a single equivalence. This is what is called the Or Ein Sof, or infinite light. Later, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, I hope I pronounced that correctly, was to discuss God as beyond infinite and certainly beyond light. Beyond infinite is something like saying beyond beyond. In a later article, God willing, we'll explore that very important idea, but to know what is beyond beyond, we must first have some idea of what is before beyond. That is the infinite light, the infinite. The infinite light is a very mystifying term. Let's engage our minds to touch just a little of the awe that phrase should ignite. First, we'll put aside the infinite for a minute and start with the light. Let's get super analytical about the above passage. Obviously, we're not speaking of light as something shiny that allows you to see objects or as a spectrum of radiant electromagnetic energy. We're speaking of the original primal energy, that from which all energy, including physical energy, eventually results. Energy means the capacity for something new to come about. The primal energy would be the capacity for anything at all to come about. So, read light as, quote unquote, the capacity for isness, or being, or existence. Maybe at this point you're starting to see how this reflects what I've been going over in my videos on absolute infinity, where I talk about being with a capital B and existence itself. So that's what isness is. So read light as the capacity for isness. It's not just light, it's being, it's existence itself. And that's what they say too. Being or existence, those are other ways to refer to it. In Hebrew, it basically translates to isness. And then next is meditation on infinite isness. So instead of calling it the infinite light, the article starts calling it infinite isness from here on out. Right now, open your mind and think of the isness of everything. Everything is. But here we're not talking about merely the thingness of everything, we're talking about the isness of it all. Meaning not the way that anything is, not anything particular about any of them, just that it all is. The infinite light is that which makes it possible that anything at all is. The article continues, now open your mind as wide as possible and think of an unlimited capacity for this isness. Isness of absolutely anything. These are actually the words that this article is using. So what I love about this article and Jewish non-duality in general is that it uses the same terms that I tend to use in my videos. So it sort of clicked with me, and I'm often told that the words I use are very clarifying, and so I see these similar descriptions as clarifying as well because they sort of parallel that same word usage. So it says the isness of absolutely anything, and that's one of the other ways I refer to absolute infinity. I say that it's absolutely anything, or a state of absolute anythingness. So it's not just everything that actually is, not just plants and animals, not just earth, water, wind, and fire, not just negative and positive energy, matter and antimatter, not just time and as many dimensions of space as physicists may determine, but literally anything. And the article continues, anything would include an infinite number of alternatives to time and space, each with infinite dimensions of their own, an infinite number of alternatives to the laws and patterns of nature as we know it, along with the possibility for no laws and patterns whatsoever. In other words, infinite versions of chaos would exist in this state of anythingness as well. An infinite spectrum of isness stretches beyond alternatives to anything we even know of. When all is equally possible, then all possibilities are equivalent. There are no boundaries, nothing to distinguish one possibility from another. Rather, all exists as a perfectly homogeneous whole. Having infinite possibilities is something like turning the contrast all the way down on your computer display. Think about that. At zero contrast, all distinction of meaning disappears. In other words, all meanings become equally valid. And so this is another thing that I love about this article and how it explains things, because it really emphasizes the nature of absolute truth in that it is ironically relative and subjective. And now the article continues here, if so, rather than a set of anything, the infinite light may be better described as the ultimate nothing. Not nothing in the sense of being a null set, but quite the opposite. Nothing as no things. Now, let me say here, when they say nothing in this article, they don't mean it in the same way that I use the word. When I say nothing, I mean it so literally that it's literally no things at all. What they're saying in this article is not literally no things at all. They just mean no particular things. Like they're talking about turning the contrast on your computer display all the way down to zero. So you wouldn't see any particular items on your screen at that point. And that's what they're referring to as things. What they're referring to as things, I would more specifically identify as particular things, as relative things. So really, when they say nothing, they're still talking about this state of anythingness and having no distinctions at all. And so the article continues, within the infinite light, within the boundless capacity for the isness of all things, distinct things cannot emerge. See, there it is. They're providing their definition. Their definition for what a thing is a distinct or particular thing, as I've just said. Now, I have to disagree here in that they say that distinct things cannot emerge in this infinite state. As I explained in my last video on duality being non-dualistic, I said that relativity, relative experience, like the one you're having right now, doesn't oppose the absolute experience. Rather, all these relative things that we're experiencing, they're all encapsulated by the absolute experience. All relative experiences contribute to, they sum up to the absolute experience. So I would disagree with this article when it says that distinct things cannot emerge. I would say that naturally they do emerge within this undistinct state of anythingness. But that's what it says. It says distinct things cannot emerge, all is one. And of course I would agree with that last statement, all is one, but you don't need to get rid of relativity in order for all to be one. Rather, you just need to realize that all relative experiences contribute to this one absolute experience. In other words, all for one and one for all. So quite literally, all is one. But now the article continues, by now you may have realized that the anythingness, they're using another one of my words there again, you may have realized that the anythingness or isness of the infinite light is beyond the capacity of the human imagination to conceive, no matter how wide you open your mind. I've said this before too, how you can never fully grasp absolute infinity. Of course you can grasp parts of it, because the experience you're having right now is a part of it. And certainly you can imagine what you're experiencing right now. You can imagine more than what you're experiencing right now. So of course you can partially conceive of absolute infinity, but you can never grasp the whole, because the whole is endless. No matter how much of it you grasp, there will always be more. That's what it means to be infinite. So that's what they mean in this article when they say that it's beyond the capacity of the imagination to conceive it. They're saying that it can never be fully conceived, as I've said and I would agree with. But now the article continues, one thing that we can understand, however, is that the infinite light does not provide a stage for our reality to be real. Again, I would disagree here in that it does provide a stage for our reality to be real. As I've said, this relative reality is not an illusion, it's just a subjective reality that's partial and encapsulated within the whole. The article continues, where anything is possible, nothing has meaning. I would disagree there again. I wouldn't say that everything becomes meaningless. I would just say that meaning becomes relative. And there's an infinite difference between meaninglessness and relative meaning. Relative meaning means that meaning still exists. It's just that what things mean will be different between every person or between every being. Meaning is still present, it's flexible. So that doesn't mean that everything has no meaning at all. So I would disagree with that. Now it continues, our world inside the infinite light would play out something like a light show in broad daylight, or better yet, inside the orb of the sun itself. So think about what it's saying there. It's stating something similar to what I keep saying about how our subjective realities are included within this one infinite ultimate reality, and they're so minuscule and infinitesimal to it that it uses this example of our reality being like a light show played out inside the sun itself. And I would even say that's complimenting our reality, because light shows being compared to the size and power of our sun, that's still a finite comparison, but our reality is literally infinitesimally small compared to the absolute reality. So I would say that their example is actually a compliment, but as I've said, it doesn't mean that our reality doesn't matter at all. It still does. It's just minuscule compared to the whole, but it still matters and it still contributes to that whole. The article continues, like a fleeting thought within a heart pounding with emotion, like a momentary fantasy forgotten within the sea of an endless daydream, yet much less than any of that, because those are all relations of finite qualities. Here we are speaking of the infinite, and that's basically just stating what I just said. It's using finite examples to try and compare us to absolute infinity. So throughout this whole article so far, it's stating God to be anything and everything, being itself, or as it says, the infinite capacity for isness. So this next part of the article is titled, "What do you call a God who is everything?" So the article reads, "What you may well be asking is, if this is so fundamental to our understanding of reality, why isn't it everywhere throughout Jewish texts?" And it says, well, it is everywhere. It's in the two names of God. God has many names, some considered more sacred than others. But there are two that are used most consistently, and of those two, only one is truly a name. One is Elohim. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. We also don't pronounce this name casually. When not praying or reading from the Torah, we generally say Elohim, substituting a K for the H. Elohim is not really a name, but a title. It means one that is mighty. Mighty people or angels are also given the title Elohim, and then it can be pronounced at any time. But as it applies to God, it means the one who is almighty, because he is the master of all powers that be, all powers that exist. Then there is the four-letter name that we do not pronounce even in prayer. It was uttered only in the ancient temple in the daily priestly blessing. Once a year, when the high priest would perform the Yom Kippur service, he would also pronounce this name, and all the people who heard would fall to the ground and prostrate themselves. In prayer and in Torah reading, we substitute the name Adonai, but like Elohim, we don't pronounce that name when not necessary. Generally, we refer to this name simply as Hashem, which means the name. Here I will use the standard convention of Kabbalists and call this name by a transposition of its letters Hafayeh, which actually carries some of the meaning of this name. Hafayeh is a name, not a title. It can never refer to anyone other than the one it refers to, and does not accept a possessive suffix such as my Hafayeh or your Hafayeh. It is called, quote-unquote, the essential name, which is fascinating because Hafayeh is a conjugation of the verb to be. So in other words, God's name itself is a conjugation of the verb to be. Going back to that idea that God is being itself. The Code of Jewish Law tells us that when reading this name, we are to understand it as, quote-unquote, was, is, and will be, wrapped up into a single word. So basically past, present, and future all wrapped up into one singularity, into one eternally present moment. That's how they're told to understand this word in Jewish law. The article continues, we're also told that it can be read as, quote-unquote, causing to be. In the language we've adopted here, we're talking about the infinite light, the boundless capacity for isness. Indeed, the word Hafayeh that we substitute for the actual pronunciation means existence, being, or isness, which is why I emphasized that this is a name and not a title, because if it were a title, the meaning would be, quote-unquote, the one who was, is, and will be, or the one who is causing being. However, since it's a name, that reading is incorrect. God is not the one who is, he is. There it is again. God is being itself. He is. The absolute is and the capacity for all isness. That is what the infinite light is referring to. The last part of the article goes into basically how viewing God in this way, it's impossible to not believe in God, because I'm not going to actually read this whole section. I can just summarize it and paraphrase it. But it's basically saying that if God is existence itself, then of course God exists. If you say God doesn't exist in this context, then you're saying existence doesn't exist, which is illogical. Existence by definition must exist. Most people would love this idea of God as existence itself because it means that God has to exist. There's no more need to provide proof of God's existence because God is existence itself. However, I realize that there will also be some other people who don't necessarily like viewing God in this context. You know, maybe they'll think to themselves, well, yeah, I like that it gives a definitive proof of God's existence, but I don't like how it views God as existence itself. You know, maybe people will view God in a more personal way, and they may think that viewing God as existence itself makes God sound impersonal or even non-sentient, like he's not really a being who has power over the universe. Well, to that, let me say that this idea that God is existence itself does not at all in any way contradict the views of God as a personal being who controls all of the powers that be. Here's why. If God is everything, if God is all that exists, then that means that God is all of the consciousness and all of the personas that exist. In other words, it doesn't get any more personal than God being existence itself, because God would be all personalities summed up into one greater overarching personality, a supreme personality, you could say, which is often how Krishna is referred to in Hinduism. He's referred to as the supreme personality of Godhead. And then as for it making God sound less potent, like, you know, doesn't really have willful control over everything, I would actually say that viewing God as existence itself paints him out in the opposite manner. If God is existence itself, then all of the operations within existence, those are all his controls. Those are all his powers. The forces in existence are his forces that he controls willingly, just like how you control your own body. So this is a very all-encompassing view of God if you examine it closely, very closely. And that's what I like about non-dual traditions, is that they all provide these all-encompassing views in some sense or another. And this particular tradition of Kabbalah, or Jewish non-duality, really emphasizes that all-accepting view, that the absolute truth is a state of absolute anythingness and relativity, and so absolute truth by its nature is, ironically, that all truth is relative. So that's ultimately why I wanted to make a video providing insights into Kabbalah or Jewish non-dualism, because it paves over and supports everything that I say when I talk about absolute truth. So it can clarify it and even offer another perspective to it. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. My next video will be talking about the significance of zodiac signs. Do they matter? Do they not matter? So stay tuned for that. Until then, create a nice day.